Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. History is told as a story of improvement, of movement from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from savagery toward civilization. And this story is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that questioning it feels like madness, feels like denying the obvious, like rejecting the evidence that surrounds us in the form of technology, medicine, institutions, all the apparatus that makes contemporary life safer, longer, more comfortable than life in previous centuries. But the story is a story, is a narrative constructed retrospectively, is an interpretation imposed on events that could be read differently, could be organized into different patterns, could reveal trajectories other than progress. And the other trajectories are visible once the mythology is recognized as mythology. Once the belief in linear improvement is seen as belief rather than fact, as framework rather than discovery, as one way of organizing time among many possible ways, and the ways that are not chosen are the ones where time is cyclical, where history repeats, where civilizations rise and fall in patterns that suggest not progress, but oscillation, not improvement, but alternation between order and chaos, between flourishing and collapse. And collapse is what the mythology of progress cannot acknowledge, cannot incorporate, cannot make sense of, except as temporary setback, as aberration, as the exception that proves the rule. But what if collapse is not the exception, but the rule, is not the deviation, but the pattern, is what happens to every complex system eventually, inevitably, necessarily, because complexity is fragile, is requiring constant energy to maintain. And when the energy fails, when the resources are exhausted, when the conditions that allowed the complexity to emerge are no longer present, the system simplifies, degrades, collapses back into disorder. And this is not failure, but thermodynamics, is not moral failing, but physical law, is entropy doing what entropy does. And entropy is not progress, is not moving toward anything, is not improving but is equalizing, is smoothing out gradients, is converting order into disorder, structure into randomness. And life civilization, all the complexity that humans value, is temporary resistance to this process, is local pockets of order maintained at the cost of increasing disorder elsewhere. And the elsewhere is growing, is expanding, is eventually consuming the local, because the second law is inexorable, is not suspended by hope or effort or belief in progress. And so the mythology of progress is fighting against physics, is claiming that the arrow of time points toward improvement, when really it points toward heat death, toward the end of difference, the end of structure, the end of everything that makes progress possible. And the possible is temporary, is the brief window during which complexity can exist, can build, can imagine itself to be moving forward, when really it is just moving, is just changing, is just reconfiguring before the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is what history shows when the mythology is removed, when the narrative of progress is recognized as narrative, as story, as interpretation, because what history actually shows is cycles, is empires rising and falling, is knowledge being gained and lost, is technologies being invented and forgotten, Is civilizations reaching heights and then collapsing into darkness from which new civilizations emerge? And the emergence is not progress, is not improvement, is just the cycle continuing, is the pattern repeating, is order arising from chaos and returning to chaos in the rhythm that characterizes complex systems. And complex systems are not stable, are not sustainable, are not moving toward equilibrium, but are far from equilibrium, are maintained by constant input of energy. And when the input falters, the system collapses. And the collapse is not pathological, is not avoidable, is built into the structure, is the natural end of complexity. And the end comes for every civilization, has come for every civilization, will come for this civilization, because the conditions that allow it to exist are temporary, are contingent, are dependent on resources that are finite, on stability that is fragile, on assumptions that are false. And the false assumptions include the mythology of progress, include the belief that things are getting better, that humanity is moving forward, that the future will be superior to the past, and the superiority is measured in terms that already assume progress, is using metrics like lifespan and GDP and technological capacity. And these metrics show increase, show growth, show what looks like improvement, but improvement toward what? Toward what end? Toward what purpose? And the purpose is assumed, is not questioned, is taken as obvious, as self-evident, that more is better, that longer is better, that faster is better. But these are values, are choices, are not facts, are not discoveries, are impositions of meaning onto patterns that have no inherent meaning, and the meaning could be otherwise, could value stability over growth, could value harmony over domination, could value cyclical return over linear advance, and the advance is the mythology, is the story that the Enlightenment told, is the narrative that science and reason and individual liberty would lead to continuous improvement, to the perfectibility of human nature, to the triumph over suffering, over ignorance, over all the limitations that had constrained previous generations. And the triumph has not arrived, has not materialized, because the limitations were not overcome, but were transformed, were replaced by new limitations, new forms of suffering, new kinds of ignorance. And the new is not better than the old, is just different, is just the current configuration of problems that arise from the current configuration of solutions. Because every solution creates new problems, every technology introduces new vulnerabilities, every increase in power produces new risks, and the risks accumulate, compound, create the conditions for collapse, for the failure of the systems that have become too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on conditions remaining stable. And stability is the exception, is the temporary state, is what complex systems move away from rather than toward, because complexity is dynamic, is changing, is adapting to pressures, and the adaptation is not progress but is response, is the system trying to maintain itself in the face of entropy, in the face of breakdown, in the face of the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is collapse, is the return to less complex states, is what happens when the energy required to maintain complexity exceeds the energy available, and the available is declining, is becoming scarce, is the resource base that allowed industrial civilization to emerge and that is now depleting, is now running out, is now revealing that the progress was not sustainable, was not based on infinite resources, but on finite stores that are being exhausted. And the exhaustion is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was extraction, was the conversion of ancient sunlight into temporary complexity, into the structures that seem permanent, but are actually contingent, are actually dependent on inputs that are ending. And the ending is not failure, but is thermodynamics, is physics, is the way things work. And the way things work does not care about progress, does not care about human narratives, does not care about the stories that civilizations tell themselves to make sense of their existence. And the stories are necessary, are functional, are what allow coordination, are what create meaning, but they are not true, are not describing reality, are describing a constructed reality, a narrative reality, a reality that exists only in the collective imagination and that can be maintained only as long as the collective continues to believe. And the believing is becoming difficult, is becoming strained, because the evidence is mounting that progress has stalled, that the improvements have stopped, that the future is not going to be better than the present, might be worse, might be collapse, might be the simplification that has come for every other civilization and is now coming for this one. And the coming is not apocalypse, is not the end of everything, is just the end of this particular configuration, this particular arrangement of complexity. And what follows is not nothing but is different, is simpler, is less organized, less centralized, less dependent on the global systems that are currently failing, currently fragmenting, currently revealing their fragility. And the fragility was always there, was always the condition of complexity, was always the cost of building systems that are far from equilibrium, that require constant energy to maintain. And the energy is failing, is becoming unreliable, is exposing the mythology of progress as mythology, as story, as belief. That was never fact, was never discovery, was always interpretation, always narrative, always the imposition of meaning onto patterns that could mean anything, that could be organized into any story, and the story that is told shapes the response, shapes what is seen as problem and what is seen as solution, shapes whether collapse is recognized as collapse or is interpreted as temporary setback, as challenge to be overcome, as opportunity for innovation. And innovation is the god of. Progress is the answer to every problem, is the belief that human ingenuity can overcome any limitation, can solve any crisis, can extend the trajectory of improvement indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the lie, is the impossibility, is the claim that entropy can be defeated, that complexity can be maintained forever, that the conditions that allowed progress are permanent when they're temporary, are contingent, are ending. And the ending is visible in the stagnation of median incomes, in the declining returns on technology, in the increasing fragility of supply chains, in the breakdown of institutions, in the resurgence of tribalism, in all the signs that the center is not holding, that the complexity is too much, that the system is simplifying, whether it wants to or not. And the not wanting is the clinging to the mythology, is the insistence that progress must continue, that the future must be better, that collapse is not possible, not thinkable, not allowable, but the allowable is not up to humans, is not subject to preference, is determined by physics, by resources, by the limits that cannot be overcome through belief or effort or innovation. And the limits are asserting themselves, are becoming visible, are revealing that the mythology of progress was always just that, was always story, was always the narrative that a particular civilization told itself during its particular window of complexity. And the window is closing, is narrowing, is approaching the point where the story can no longer be maintained, where the evidence of stagnation and decline becomes overwhelming, becomes undeniable, becomes the new reality that requires a new story, a new mythology, and the new mythology is not yet formed, is not yet coherent, is emerging in fragments, in the recognition that growth cannot continue, that resources are finite, that complexity is fragile, that collapse is not aberration, but pattern, not failure but phase, not the end but the transition. And the transition is what humans are bad at, are resisting, are denying, because the mythology of progress makes transition look like regression, makes simplification look like failure, makes collapse look like catastrophe, when it is just change, is just the system moving to a different state, a less complex state, a state that requires less energy, less resources, less organization. And the less is not worse, is not better, is just different, is the configuration that is possible given the conditions. And the conditions are changing, are no longer supporting the complexity, are no longer providing the energy, are no longer maintaining the stability. And so the system is responding, is adapting, is simplifying. And the simplifying is collapse, is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was never linear, was never guaranteed, was never more than a temporary pattern that emerged under specific conditions, and that is now ending as those conditions change. And the changing is not stoppable, is not reversible, is the natural progression of complex systems, is what happens when entropy reasserts itself, when the local order that was maintained at great cost can no longer be maintained, and what remains is disorder, is simplicity, is the lower energy state that does not require the constant input, the constant effort, the constant belief in progress, that was never more than belief, was never fact, was never discovery, was always mythology, and mythologies end, are always ending, are replaced by new mythologies that make sense of the new conditions, and the new conditions are simplification, are localization, are the breakdown of the global systems that defined progress, that made progress visible, that created the metrics by which improvement was measured, and the measuring is ending, is becoming irrelevant, because the systems that supported the measuring are fragmenting, are collapsing, are revealing that they were never as solid as they seemed, were always contingent, always temporary, always dependent on conditions that are now changing, and the changing is what humans must adapt to, must respond to, must accept, because the accepting is what allows response, what allows adaptation, what makes survival possible. And survival is not progress, is not improvement, is just continuation, is just the persistence of life in new forms, in simpler forms, in forms that do not require the mythology of progress, that do not assume the future will be better, that do not measure themselves against an imagined trajectory of improvement. And the imagined was always the problem, was always the mythology, was the story that made sense when complexity was increasing, when energy was abundant, when resources seemed infinite, but none of those conditions hold. Anymore, none of those assumptions are valid. And so the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as mythology. And what is being revealed is not that progress was false, but that it was conditional, was temporary, was the pattern of a particular phase. And the phase is ending, is giving way to a different phase, a phase of simplification, of localization, of the breakdown, of complexity. And the breakdown is not the end, but is transition, is the movement from one state to another, from high complexity to lower complexity, from global systems to local systems, from the mythology of progress to something else, to some other story, some other way of making sense of time, of organizing history, of understanding change. And the understanding is what is needed, is what allows the transition to be navigated, allows collapse to be survived, allows the species to persist beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, into a future that is not better or worse but different, is not moving forward or backward, but is just moving, is just changing, is just the continuation of patterns that have always characterized life, that have always characterized civilizations, that have always involved cycles of increase and decrease, of complexity and simplification, of rise and fall. And the fall is not tragedy, is not failure, is just the other half of the cycle, is the return that follows every advance, is the simplification that follows every increase in complexity, is the natural, inevitable, thermodynamically necessary end of every period of growth. And growth cannot be infinite, cannot continue forever, must end, must reverse, must give way to simplification. And the simplification is happening, is visible, is undeniable once the mythology is set aside, once the belief in progress is recognized as belief, as story, as narrative that served a purpose but is no longer serving that purpose, is no longer making sense of the present, is no longer predicting the future, is no longer functioning as mythology should function. And so it is being abandoned, is being replaced, is giving way to new stories, new frameworks, new ways of understanding time. and the new ways are not yet clear, are not yet coherent, are emerging in the recognition that progress was always mythology, that linear time was always story, that improvement was always interpretation, and that the patterns of history are not linear but cyclical, not progressive but oscillating, not moving toward anything but just moving, just changing, just expressing the dynamics of complex systems that arise and fall, that order and disorder, that complexify and simplify in rhythms that have nothing to do with progress, nothing to do with improvement, nothing to do with the narratives that humans tell, but are just the way things work, the way systems behave, the way entropy plays out in the temporary pockets of order that are life, that are civilization, that are all the complexity that seems permanent but is actually fleeting, actually momentary, actually the brief resistance to the overwhelming tendency toward disorder. And the disorder is not evil, is not failure, is not the end of meaning, is just the default state, the equilibrium, the simplicity that complex systems return to. And the return is not tragedy, but is nature, is physics, is the way things are. And accepting this, accepting that progress was mythology, that collapse is natural, that the future is not moving forward, but is just moving, is what allows the transition, allows the adaptation, allows the species to survive beyond the mythology, beyond the belief that made sense for a while, but makes sense no longer. And the no longer is now, is the present, is the moment when the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as story, and the story is ending. Not because it was false, but because it was conditional, was applicable only under certain conditions, and the conditions have changed, are changing, are no longer supporting the narrative, are no longer making progress visible, are no longer sustaining the belief, and so the belief is fading, is being replaced by something else, by the recognition that time is not linear, that history is not progressive, that the future is not determined by the past in any simple way, that complexity and simplicity alternate, that rise and fall are phases of the same cycle. And the cycle is what matters, is what persists, is what continues beyond any particular civilization, beyond any particular mythology, beyond any particular belief about where time is going or what the future holds. Because the future holds nothing except change, holds nothing except the continuation of patterns that have always operated, that operate now, that will continue to operate regardless of what humans believe, regardless of what stories they tell, regardless of the mythologies they construct to make sense of their existence. And the existence continues, adapts, persists, not through progress but through change, not through improvement but through transformation, not through moving forward but through moving, just changing, just being what systems are, which is dynamic, unstable, temporary, and always, eventually, inevitably, returning to simplicity, returning to disorder, returning to the state from which complexity briefly emerged and to which it always returns. And the return is not the end, but is the pattern, is the cycle, is the way things work. And working with this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows humans to move beyond the mythology of progress, beyond the belief in linear time, beyond the narrative of improvement, into a relationship with time that is more honest, more realistic, more aligned with the actual patterns of history. And the actual patterns are not progressive, but are cyclical, are not moving forward but are oscillating, are not improving but are changing. And the changing is all there is all there ever was, is all there ever will be. And the will be is not better, is not worse, is just different, is just the future, is just what comes next. And what comes next is not determined by mythology, is not shaped by belief in progress, is not the continuation of improvement, but is the continuation of patterns, of cycles, of the rise and fall that has always characterized complexity, that has always characterized civilization, that is now revealing itself again, is now becoming visible again, is now showing that progress was always temporary, was always conditional, was always mythology, and mythology's end, must end, are ending now. And what comes after is not nothing but is different. Is the next story, the next framework, the next way of making sense of time, and the sense that is made will not include progress, will not assume improvement, will not project linear advance, but will recognize cycles, will accept collapse, will understand that complexity and simplicity alternate, that neither is permanent, that both are phases, and that the phase of progress, the phase of increasing complexity, the phase of the mythology is ending, is giving way to simplification, to collapse, to the next phase of the cycle. And the next phase is not tragedy, is not the end, is just different, is just what comes after growth, is just the return to lower complexity, and the return is natural, is inevitable, is happening now. And recognizing this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows the transition, what allows the adaptation, what makes survival possible beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, beyond the narrative that time moves forward. Because time does not move forward, time just moves, just changes, just continues, and the continuing is not progress, but is just continuation, is just the persistence of patterns, of cycles, of the dynamics that have always operated and will always operate, regardless of what humans believe, regardless of the mythologies they construct, regardless of the stories they tell themselves, to make the chaos bearable. And the chaos is bearable, has always been bearable, is just change, is just the way things are, and the way things are does not include progress, does not include improvement, does not include the mythology, includes only change, only cycles, only the oscillation between complexity and simplicity, between order and disorder, between the rise that seems like progress and the fall that reveals. It was always just phase, just pattern, just the temporary resistance to entropy that all complex systems represent. And the representation is ending, is collapsing, is returning to simplicity. And the simplicity is not the end, but is the beginning, is the ground from which new complexity might emerge, might rise, might begin a new cycle. And the new cycle will not be progress, but will just be cycle, will just be pattern, will just be the continuation of dynamics that do not care about human narratives, do not respond to human beliefs, do not acknowledge the mythology of progress, except as one more temporary pattern that emerged and fell, that rose and collapsed, that was and is no longer, and the no longer is now. Language pretends to capture the world, pretends to translate experience into symbols that can be shared, but the translation is always incomplete, is always leaving something behind, something essential that resists being put into words, and this resistance is not a failure of vocabulary, not a problem that could be solved by inventing new terms or refining definitions, but is structural, is built into the nature of language itself, into the gap between the thing and the word for the thing, between the experience and the description of the experience. And this gap is not empty, but is filled with silence, with the ineffable, with everything that can be shown, but not said, felt but not expressed, known but not communicated. And the knowing that cannot be communicated is most of what matters, is the substance of experience, is the raw sensation of being alive, of being conscious, of existing as this particular point of awareness at this particular moment. And no arrangement of words can convey this, can make someone else feel what is felt, can bridge the gap between one consciousness and another, because words are public, are shared, are defined by use and convention, while experience is private, is immediate, is defined by the perspective from which it arises, and perspectives cannot be shared, can only be described, and description is always external, is always at a remove, is always pointing towards something rather than presenting it. And the pointing is all that language can do, is the limit of what symbols can achieve, and the limit is reached quickly, is encountered as soon as one tries to say what anything is really like, what it feels like from the inside, what quality it has that makes it this experience rather than that experience. And the thisness cannot be said, can only be shown, can only be gestured toward, and the gesture is not the thing, is not a substitute, is only an indication that there is something there, something beyond the words, something in the silence beneath language. And the silence is not absence, but presence, is not the lack of sound, but the space where meaning lives before it is forced into form, before it is compressed into sentences, before it is reduced to the linearity of speech. And speech is linear, is one word after another, is sequential, is bound by time. While experience is simultaneous, is layered, is happening all at once in ways that cannot be captured by the march of syllables. And the march misses the music, misses the texture, misses the way that experience is not composed of discrete elements that can be named separately, but is a continuous flow that is divided by language into artificial units. And the units are useful, are necessary for communication, for thought, for the organization of experience into manageable pieces. But the organization is a lie, is a convenience, is the imposition of structure onto something that has no structure, or has a structure so complex, so multidimensional, that it cannot be mapped onto the one-dimensional track of language. And the track is narrow, is constraining, is forcing everything to line up, to follow rules, to fit into grammar. And grammar is a cage, is a set of requirements that limit what can be said, how it can be said, what relationships can be expressed. And the relationships in experience are not grammatical, are not subject-verb-object, are not causal in the simple sense that language demands, are more like music, more like the way that notes relate to each other, not through logic, but through resonance, through harmony, through the ineffable rightness of certain combinations. And rightness is not a property that can be defined, can only be recognized, can only be felt. And the feeling is what language cannot capture, is what remains in the silence, is what is lost when experience is translated into words. And the loss is total, is not a matter of degree but of kind, because words and experience are different types of things, are operating in different domains, and the attempt to convert one into the other is like trying to describe colour to someone who has never seen. And the description can list properties, can talk about wavelength and frequency, can use metaphors, can compare it to other experiences, but none of this conveys what colour is, what it is like to see red. And the like is the problem, is the word that points to the gap, to the subjective quality that cannot be communicated, can only be experienced. And experiencing is not communicating, is not sharing, is not the public act that language performs, but is the private act that language can only gesture toward. And the gesture is clumsy, is inadequate, is using blunt instruments to point at something delicate, something subtle, something that disappears. When focused on too directly, when examined too closely, when forced into the harsh light of explicit statement, and explicit is what language demands, is what words require, is the naming of things, the drawing of boundaries, the making of distinctions. And distinctions are violence, are cuts, are the separation of what is continuous into discrete parts, and the parts are not the whole, cannot be reassembled into the whole, because the relationships between parts are not the same as the parts themselves. And language can name the parts, but cannot capture the relationships, except through more words, more parts. And the regress is infinite, is never arriving at the thing itself, is always operating at a remove, in the space of representation rather than the space of presence. And presence is what is lost, is what words cannot hold, because words are abstract, are general, are applying to many instances rather than this instance, this particular moment, this unique occurrence that has never happened before and will never happen again. And the never again is what makes experience precious, is what gives it weight, is what makes the silence beneath language so full, so rich, so irreducibly important, because the silence is where the particular lives, where the unrepeatable exists, where the singular moment is happening. And language can only speak in universals, in categories, in types, and types are not tokens, are not the actual things, but the classes that actual things are sorted into. And the sorting is useful, but is also destructive, is losing the individuality, the specificity, the exact quality that makes this thing what it is. And what it is cannot be said, can only be pointed to. And the pointing is metaphor, is analogy, is the attempt to convey the unknown through the known, the ineffable through the effable, and the attempt always fails, is always inadequate because the known is not the unknown. The metaphor is not the thing, is only similar, only resembling, only sharing some properties while lacking others, and the lacking is what matters, is what makes the difference, is what remains unsaid in the space between the metaphor and the meaning. And the space is where poetry lives, where art lives, where music lives, because these are the forms that acknowledge the failure of literal language, that work in the silence, that use words or sounds or images not to say, but to show, not to define, but to evoke, not to capture, but to suggest. And suggestion is not statement, is not the bold claim that this is what it is, but is the tentative offering that maybe it is something like this. Maybe if you attend to this pattern, this rhythm, this arrangement, you will feel something similar to what I felt. And the feeling is the goal, is what art aims for, is the communication not of information, but of experience. And the communication is never complete, is never total, is always leaving room for interpretation, for the receiver to bring their own experience, their own associations, their own silence to fill in what the words or notes or images cannot say. And the cannot say is most of it, is the majority of what is being communicated, is happening in the spaces between words, in the pauses between notes, in the negative space around the image. And these spaces are not empty, but are full, are where meaning accumulates, where resonance happens, where the ineffable makes itself felt without ever being named. And naming is the death of the ineffable, is the attempt to drag it into language, to make it explicit, to pin it down, and the pinning kills it, turns it into something else, something smaller, something manageable, but also something false. Because the ineffable is not manageable, is not controllable, is not subject to the will, is only encountered, only experienced, only allowed to happen. And the allowing is what silence does, is what the spaces between words permit, is the acknowledgement that there is more than can be said, that language is not everything, that meaning exists in the pre-linguistic, in the non-verbal, in the realm that infants inhabit before they learn to speak. And learning to speak is learning to lose something, is gaining the ability to communicate, but losing the directness of experience, the unmediated encounter with the world. And the mediation is what language provides, is what symbols do. They stand between the self and the world, between experience and consciousness. And the standing between is interpretation, is the conversion of raw sensation into meaningful categories. And the categories are necessary for thought, for memory, for the organization of experience into narratives. But they are also barriers, are obstacles, are preventing direct contact with what is actually happening. And what is actually happening is ineffable, is beyond language, is in the realm of pure qualia, of raw feeling, of the what it is like that resists all attempts to be captured in words. And the resistance is not stubbornness, but impossibility, is not a challenge to be overcome, but a limit to be accepted. And accepting the limit is what Wittgenstein meant when he said that what can be shown cannot be said, that there are truths that can only be displayed, only demonstrated, only lived. And the living is the showing, is the way that meaning manifests in action, in gesture, in the way a life is shaped. And the shaping is not describable, is not reducible to rules or principles or propositions, is only visible in the particular, in the concrete, in the specific way that this person moved through the world, And the moving cannot be captured in biography, cannot be preserved in narrative, because narrative is selection, is choosing which moments to include and which to leave out, and what is left out is most of it, is the ordinary, the unremarkable, the moments that do not fit into story. And these moments are where life actually happens, are where experience is most dense, most rich, most full of the qualities that make it worth living. But they are also most resistant to language, most stubbornly ineffable, most insistent on remaining in the silence. And the silence is not the enemy of meaning, but its ground, is the space from which meaning emerges, is the background against which words appear. And without the background, the words have no context, no resonance, no way to mean more than they literally say. And literal meaning is thin, is insufficient, is the bare minimum of what language can do. And what language can do is not impressive when compared to what experience is. When measured against the fullness of consciousness, against the complexity of a single moment of awareness, which contains more information, more nuance, more texture than could be expressed in a lifetime of speech, and the lifetime would not be enough, would never catch up, would always be lagging behind the present moment, describing what has passed rather than what is passing. And the passing is too quick, is too fluid, is too continuous to be caught in the discrete net of words. And the net has holes, has gaps, has spaces through which most of experience escapes, and the escaping is not loss but necessity, is not failure, but the acknowledgement that language is a tool, is an instrument, is good for certain purposes, but not for all purposes, and the purposes it is not good for include the most important ones. Include the communication of what it feels like to be alive, to be conscious, to be the experiencing subject rather than the experienced object. And the subject is ineffable, is beyond language, is what looks out from behind the eyes but cannot be captured in description, cannot be made into object without ceasing to be subject. And the ceasing is what happens when language tries to grasp consciousness, tries to make it explicit, tries to say what the self is, and the self dissolves under scrutiny, becomes elusive, becomes nothing that can be pinned down. And the pinning down is what language wants to do, is what definition aims for, is the fixing of meaning, the stabilization of reference, the establishment of clear boundaries. But consciousness has no clear boundaries, bleeds into the world, into the body, into the past and future. And the bleeding is what makes it alive, what makes it dynamic, what makes it impossible to freeze into the static forms that language provides. And the forms are useful, are necessary, are what allow communication, but they are also prisons, are constraints, are limiting what can be thought, what can be imagined, what can be experienced, because experience that cannot be named is harder to remember, harder to think about, harder to integrate into the narrative of the self. And the narrative is what the self is the story told in language. But the story is not the self, is not the experiencing, is only the account given after the fact, the retrospective interpretation, the organization of memory into coherent form. And the coherence is imposed, is not discovered, is the work of language forcing experience into structure, into sequence, into causality. And causality is not in experience, is not felt, is only inferred, is the story told about why one thing followed another. But the following is not experienced as causality, is experienced as succession, as one thing and then another thing. And the "and then" is not because, is not explanation, is just the temporal order. And the order is all that is given, all that is directly experienced, and everything else is interpretation, is language filling in the gaps, making connections, building narratives. And the narratives are necessary, are what make life make sense, but they are also false, are always false, because they are simplifications, are reductions, are taking the overwhelming complexity of experience and compressing it into the manageable linearity of story. And story is not experience, is not the living, but the telling, and the telling is always after, is always too late, is always missing the immediacy, the presence, the nowness of experience, and the nowness cannot be said, can only be lived, can only be here in this moment, in the silence beneath language where everything is happening that words can never capture, never hold, never preserve, because words are time-bound, are sequential, are passing as soon as they are spoken, while experience is timeless, is eternal in the sense of being always now, always present, never past or future, but only this, and this cannot be said, can only be shown, and the showing is what happens when language stops, when the attempt to describe gives way to silence, when the acknowledgement is made that there is nothing more to say, because what needs to be communicated is not in the words, but in the space they create, in the resonance they leave behind, in the way they point beyond themselves to something that cannot be named, but only felt, only recognized, only known in the direct encounter. And the encounter is what matters, is what language is trying to facilitate, is what all the words are aiming toward, the moment when meaning transfers not through symbols but through presence, through the showing rather than the saying, through the silence that is full rather than empty, through the space beneath language where experience lives and words cannot reach. And the not reaching is not failure, but is the nature of things, is the way that consciousness and language exist in different domains, operate on different principles, serve different purposes, and the purposes do not align, do not overlap except at the edges, and the edges are where poetry happens, where music happens, where art happens, in the borderland between the sayable and the unsayable, between the explicit and the implicit, between the word and the silence. And the silence is not the opposite of language, but its foundation, is the ground from which words emerge and to which they return, is the space that holds everything that cannot be said but only shown, only felt, only known in the living. And the living is what happens here, in this moment, in the silence beneath language where meaning is not constructed but is simply present, is simply here, is simply this, and this is all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be, and it cannot be said, can never be said, will never be said, because it is not the kind of thing that words can hold, is not reducible to symbols, is not translatable into the public language of communication, is only available in the private silence of experience, and the experience is incommunicable, is irreducibly private, is locked inside the perspective from which it arises, and the locking is not a problem, but a fact, is not something to be overcome, but something to be accepted, and accepting it is what allows language to be used without expecting too much from it, without demanding that it do what it cannot do, which is to say, everything, to capture everything, to make everything explicit, because everything cannot be made explicit, can only be shown, and the showing is what happens in the silence, in the spaces between words, in the pauses that are not empty but full, full of everything that language leaves behind, everything that resists being said, everything that remains ineffable. And the ineffable is not a lack but a richness, is not what is missing but what is present, is the substance of experience that words can only point toward, can only gesture at, can only acknowledge without capturing. And the acknowledgement is enough, is all that can be asked, is the recognition that there is more, always more than can be said, more than can be thought, more than can be communicated, and the more is in the silence, is beneath language, is where meaning lives when it is not being forced into form, when it is not being compressed into sentences, when it is allowed to simply be, to exist without explanation, without definition, without the violence of naming. And the violence is what language does, is what words require, is the cutting up of experience into pieces. And the pieces are not the whole, cannot be the whole, because the whole is continuous, is undivided, is the seamless flow of consciousness that cannot be broken without being destroyed. And the destruction is what language performs, is the necessary sacrifice that communication demands, is the price of being able to share anything at all, but the sharing is always partial, is always leaving the most important part behind, leaving it in the silence where it belongs, where it is safe from the distortions of language, where it remains ineffable, unnameable, unsayable. And the unsayable is everything that matters, is everything that makes life worth living, is everything that cannot be communicated but only lived. And the living is what happens in the silence, in the space beneath language, in the moments when words stop and presence begins. And the beginning is what language can never capture, because it is always arriving after, always describing what has already happened, what has already passed, what is already gone. And the gone is where language lives, in the past, in the memory, in the reconstruction, while experience lives in the present, in the now, in the immediate, and the immediate is ineffable, is beyond words, is in the silence, and the silence is full, is rich, is the ground of everything, is what holds all meaning before it is spoken, all truth before it is said, all experience before it is described. And the before is where it is most real, most alive, most itself, and language can never reach it, can only point toward it, can only acknowledge that there is something there, something in the silence beneath language, something that can be shown but never said, and the showing is all there is all that matters, is the only way that meaning can be transmitted, not through words but through the presence that words evoke, not through saying but through the silence that saying creates, and the creation is what language is for, is what words are doing when they're used well, creating space for the ineffable, making room for the silence, acknowledging the limits, accepting that what cannot be said is more important than what can. And what can be said is only the frame, only the pointer, only the gesture toward what lies beneath, what lives in the silence, what remains forever beyond the reach of words. Putnam sat in a room and imagined two planets, identical in every way, except one, Earth and twin Earth, perfect mirrors of each other down to the last atom, the last thought, the last whispered word. And on Earth there is water, H2O, the molecule that makes up oceans and rivers and rain. And on twin Earth there is also water, but it is not H2O, it is XYZ, a completely different substance with different chemical structure, different molecular bonds, different properties at the microscopic level. Yet to everyone living on twin Earth it looks exactly like water, tastes exactly like water, behaves exactly like water. It fills their lakes and falls from their clouds and quenches their thirst just as water does on Earth. Now imagine two people, one on Earth and one on twin Earth. Call them both Oscar. And these two Oscars are molecule for molecule identical. Same brain structure, same neural patterns, same memories, same thoughts, same internal psychological states. Everything inside their heads is exactly the same. And both Oscars look at a glass of liquid and say the word water. They both think they are referring to the same thing. They both believe they know what water is, but Putnam asks a simple question that shatters centuries of philosophy. Are they actually referring to the same thing? And the answer is no. Earth Oscar's word water refers to H2O. Twin Earth Oscar's word water refers to XYZ. Same word, same internal mental state, but different meanings, different references, different extensions in the world. And this means that meaning is not determined by what is in the head. Meaning is not a function of internal psychological states. Meaning is not private, not subjective, not locked inside the skull waiting to be discovered through introspection. The tradition, before Putnam, stretching back through Locke and Hume and Descartes, believed that meanings were mental entities, that words were connected to ideas in the mind, that reference was mediated by internal representations, by concepts, by mental images, and if you wanted to know what someone meant by a word, you had to look inside their head, examine their thoughts, map their mental contents, and this made sense, it felt right. It aligned with the intuition that language is personal, that each person has their own private understanding of words, their own associations, their own mental dictionary, But Putnam showed that this entire picture was wrong, that two people could have identical mental contents and still mean different things by the same word. That meaning reaches beyond the skull, beyond the brain, beyond psychology entirely, into the world itself, into the environment, into the physical and social context that determines what words actually refer to. This is semantic externalism, the view that meanings are not in the head but out in the world. That reference is determined not by internal states but by external relations, by causal connections between words and things, by the history of how a word came to be used, by the community of speakers who share the word, by the natural kinds that exist independently of human thought. And this means that you can be wrong about what you mean. You can use a word your entire life and not know what it really refers to. You can have perfect confidence in your understanding and still be completely mistaken, because meaning is not something you possess. It is something you participate in, something that exists in the space between speakers and world, between language and reality, between words and the things they pick out. Putnam's argument did not stop at twin earth. He pushed further. He talked about the division of linguistic labour, the fact that most people do not know the technical details of what their words refer to. Most people cannot define gold in terms of atomic number, cannot distinguish an elm from a beech, cannot explain what makes aluminum different from molybdenum. Yet they use these words successfully. They refer to these things accurately, and they do so not because they have the right mental contents, but because they are embedded in a community where some people do have the expertise, where metallurgists know about aluminum, where botanists know about elms, where chemists know about gold. And when ordinary speakers use these words, they defer to the experts. They rely on the division of labour. They trust that somewhere in the linguistic community there are people who know what these words really mean, who can distinguish the real thing from the fake. And this trust is what allows language to function, what allows reference to succeed even in the absence of individual knowledge. This overturns the Cartesian picture entirely. Descartes believed that knowledge began with the self, with the contents of consciousness, with what could be known through introspection, and from there one built outward to knowledge of the world. But Putnam showed that the order is reversed, that knowledge of meaning requires knowledge of the world first, that you cannot know what you mean without knowing what your words refer to, and you cannot know what your words refer to just by looking inside your own mind. You have to look outside to the physical environment, to the social context, to the history of usage, to the experts who maintain the standards of reference. And this means that the self is not the foundation of knowledge, but a participant in a larger system, a node in a network of linguistic and social relations that determine meaning collectively, not individually, externally, not internally. Frege tried to solve the problem of meaning differently. He distinguished between sense and reference, between the mode of presentation and the thing presented, and he believed that sense was in the mind, that it mediated reference, that two people could refer to the same thing through different senses, like the morning star and the evening star, both referring to Venus, and this preserved the idea that meaning had a mental component, that internal states mattered. But Putnam's argument cut through this because on twin earth, Oscar and his counterpart have the same sense, the same mode of presentation, the same mental mediation, but they do not have the same reference. They are not talking about the same substance, and this means that sense alone does not determine reference, that no amount of mental content can fix what a word picks out in the world, that reference requires something beyond sense, beyond psychology, beyond anything that can be captured by introspection or phenomenology. Kripke reinforced this from another angle. He argued that names and natural kind terms were rigid designators, that they referred to the same thing in all possible worlds, not by virtue of satisfying a description, but by virtue of causal historical chains, that the word water refers to H2O because it was introduced to refer to a certain substance, and that reference was passed down through generations of speakers, through baptism and transmission, through ostension and use. And even if speakers lost track of what the substance was, even if they forgot its chemical composition, even if they developed false beliefs about it, the words still referred to the same thing, because reference is not determined by beliefs but by the causal connection between word and world, by the chain that links current usage back to the original act of naming, back to the moment when the word was first attached to the thing. This has radical implications for psychology, because it means psychology cannot determine reference, cannot tell you what your words mean, cannot give you the extension of your terms just by examining your mental states. And this was a blow to cognitive science, to theories of mind that tried to explain language purely in terms of internal representations, in terms of concepts and mental models and computational processes, because Putnam and Kripke showed that none of this is enough. That meaning leaks out of the head, that it requires the world, requires the community, requires the causal historical context. And without these external factors, there is no meaning at all. Just empty sounds, just syntax without semantics, just symbols shuffling around inside the skull with no connection to reality. Yet people resist this conclusion. They cling to the intuition that they know what they mean, that their words are transparent to them. That meaning is something they possess and control. And this resistance is understandable, because semantic externalism is deeply unsettling. It suggests that we are strangers to our own language, that we do not fully understand the words we speak, that meaning is not something we create, but something we inherit, something we are thrown into, something that precedes us and exceeds us, and determines what we can say before we even open our mouths. Wittgenstein saw this too, though from a different direction. He argued that meaning is use, that words get their meaning from the language games they are embedded in, from the forms of life that give them context. And he rejected the idea of private language, the idea that meaning could be purely internal, purely subjective, because a private language would have no standards of correctness, no way to distinguish between following a rule and merely thinking one is following a rule. And without standards, there is no meaning, just the illusion of meaning, just the feeling of understanding without actual understanding. And this is why language must be public, why it must be shared, why it requires a community of speakers who can correct each other, who can point out mistakes, who can maintain the norms that make reference possible. Putnam took this further. He showed not just that language is public, but that meaning is not even fully determined by the community, that it reaches beyond the community into the world itself, that natural kind terms like water and gold and tiger refer to whatever has the same underlying nature as the paradigm samples, the same deep structure, the same essential properties, and this means that meaning can outrun knowledge, that a community can use a word correctly even when they have false beliefs about what they are referring to, even when their theories are wrong, even when their understanding is incomplete, because the word latches onto the real essence, the objective structure, the natural kind that exists independently of human thought. And the world itself constrains meaning, corrects mistakes, determines reference in ways that no internal psychological state can capture. This is why Aristotle was not wrong when he talked about water, even though he did not know about molecules, even though his theory of elements was false. He was still referring to H2O because his word water was causally connected to the same substance our word water refers to, because the reference was fixed not by his beliefs, but by the stuff itself, by the samples he pointed to, by the liquid he drank and swam in and observed, and the continuity of reference across theory change, across conceptual revolutions, across the abandonment of entire frameworks, shows that meaning is anchored in the world, not in the mind, that it survives the death of theories because it was never dependent on theories in the first place. But this raises a puzzle. If meaning is not in the head, if psychological states do not determine reference, then what role does the mind play at all? What is psychology supposed to study if not meaning, if not the contents of thought, if not the representations that mediate between language and world? And Putnam's answer is that psychology studies something real. It studies mental states. It studies computational processes. It studies the functional organization of cognition, but it does not study meaning, because meaning is not a psychological phenomenon. It is a semantic phenomenon. It is a relation between words and world, between signs and reference, between language and reality, and this relation is not mediated by anything in the head. It is direct. It is external. It is constituted by causal and social factors that lie beyond the reach of introspection, beyond the scope of neuroscience, beyond the explanatory power of any psychological theory. Fodor resisted this. He wanted to preserve a role for internal content, for narrow content, for something in the head that could do explanatory work. And he argued that even if meaning is wide, even if reference is external, there must be something narrow that explains behavior, some internal state that mediates between input and output, some mental representation that the cognitive system manipulates. And he tried to carve out a space for psychology by distinguishing between wide content, which depends on the environment, and narrow content, which does not, which is purely internal, purely psychological, purely computational. But this move was always unstable because narrow content turned out to be elusive, hard to define, hard to individuate, hard to see how it could play the explanatory role Fodor wanted it to play. And many philosophers concluded that narrow content was a myth, that there was no such thing, that all content was wide, that meaning was always externalist, always dependent on factors beyond the head, and if psychology wanted to explain behavior, it would have to appeal to wide content, to states that are individuated by their relations to the environment, to representations that are only representations in virtue of their connections to what they represent. This is deeply counterintuitive, because it means that two people in identical internal states could be thinking different thoughts, could be believing different things, could be referring to different objects, just because they are in different environments, just because their words have different causal histories, just because the world around them is structured differently. And this seems to violate the intuition that mental states are internal, that what you're thinking is determined by what is going on inside your head, that consciousness is private, that the contents of experience are immediately accessible to introspection. But Putnam and Kripke showed that this intuition is wrong, that mental states are not self-intimating, that you can be mistaken about what you're thinking, that the meanings of your thoughts depend on facts about the world that you may not know, that reference is opaque, that you can use words successfully without understanding what they mean, that language works not because speakers have perfect knowledge, but because they are embedded in networks of reference that do the work for them, that connect words to things through mechanisms that operate below the level of consciousness, below the level of intentional control. Burge extended this argument to mental content itself. He argued that not just linguistic meaning, but thought itself is individuated externally, that beliefs and desires are identified by their relations to the environment, that you could not have a belief about water if you lived in a world with no water, that mental content is essentially relational, essentially dependent on what exists outside the mind, and this means that the mind is not a self-contained system, not a module that could be studied in isolation, not a computational device that processes inputs according to internal rules, but an open system, a system that is constituted by its interactions with the world, that is shaped by its environment, that cannot be understood without reference to the physical and social context it is embedded in. This has implications for artificial intelligence, for the question of whether machines can think, because if meaning is external, if reference depends on causal historical connections, if mental content is individuated by relations to the environment, then a computer program, no matter how sophisticated, cannot have genuine thoughts unless it has the right connections to the world, unless it is embedded in the right kind of causal network, unless it participates in the same linguistic and social practices that give human words their meanings. And this suggests that thought is not just computation, not just symbol manipulation, not just syntactic operations on formal structures, but something that requires embodiment, requires situatedness, requires participation in a form of life, and a brain in a vat, no matter how complex its internal processes, would not be thinking about water or trees or anything else, because its words would not be connected to anything, would not refer to anything, would be empty symbols with no semantic content, no meaning, no reference, just syntax running in a void. Putnam himself later came to doubt some of his own arguments. He worried that semantic externalism led to metaphysical realism, to the view that there is a fixed, determinate way the world is, independent of human conceptual schemes, independent of language, independent of theory, and he came to think this was incoherent, that it made reference magical, that it required a God's eye view, a perspective from nowhere that could compare words to things without being situated in any particular framework, and he moved toward internal realism, toward the view that truth and reference are always relative to a conceptual scheme, always dependent on the practices and norms of a community, always constrained by what Quine called the tribunal of experience, but never fully determined by it. And this introduced a tension, a pull between the external world that constrains reference and the internal practices that constitute meaning, a tension that Putnam never fully resolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, because meaning lives in that tension, in the space between mind and world, between language and reality, between what we intend and what our words actually pick out. Dennett approached this from yet another angle. He argued that meaning is not a real property, but a useful fiction, that intentional states are not natural kinds, but interpretive stances, that when we attribute beliefs and desires, we are not discovering facts about the mind, but adopting a strategy for predicting behaviour. And from this perspective, the question of whether meaning is in the head or in the world dissolves. Because meaning is not anywhere, it is not a real thing, but a pattern we impose, a way of organising our understanding of complex systems. And the intentional stance works whether we apply it to humans or thermostats or chess programs. The difference is just pragmatic, just a matter of what level of description is most useful for prediction and explanation. Not a matter of what really has meaning and what does not, because nothing really has meaning. Meaning is always an interpretation, always a projection, always a way of seeing that could be otherwise. But this seems too deflationary, too quick to dismiss the felt reality of meaning, the undeniable sense that words do connect to things, that thoughts are about the world. That reference is not just a useful fiction, but a real relation, and even if we cannot fully explain how this relation works, even if semantic externalism leaves gaps and puzzles, it at least takes seriously the intuition that language matters, that what we say makes a difference, that truth is not just coherence within a system, but correspondence with reality, however elusive and problematic that correspondence may be. And to give up on this, to reduce meaning to a mere interpretive stance, feels like giving up on something essential, something worth preserving even if we cannot fully explain it, even if it leads to paradoxes and tensions that resist resolution. Because the alternative is a world where nothing means anything, where language floats free of reality, where thought is cut loose from the world, and that is a world too empty, too barren, too divorced from lived experience to be acceptable, even if it is theoretically cleaner, even if it avoids the hard problems, even if it makes philosophy easier by making meaning disappear. Edmund Gettier wrote a 3-page paper in 1963 that destroyed 2,000 years of philosophy, not by offering a new theory, not by constructing an elaborate argument, not by marshalling evidence or appealing to grand principles, but simply by describing two cases, two simple scenarios where someone has a justified true belief that clearly is not knowledge. And these cases were so straightforward, so devastating, so impossible to dismiss, that they shattered the definition of knowledge that had stood since Plato, the definition that said knowledge was justified true belief. And in the decades since philosophers have tried to repair the damage, have proposed dozens of modifications and additions and qualifications, have added fourth conditions and fifth conditions, have distinguished types of justification and types of truth and types of belief, and none of it has worked. None of it has produced a definition that captures all and only cases of knowledge, that avoids counterexamples, that does what definitions are supposed to do. And the question is whether this failure reveals something about knowledge itself, whether knowledge resists definition not because philosophers have not been clever enough, but because definition is the wrong tool, because knowledge is not the kind of thing that can be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, because the project of analysing knowledge was misconceived from the start. The cases themselves are almost too simple. In one, a person looks at a clock that has stopped but happens to look at the moment when the stop time matches the actual time. They form a justified true belief about what time it is. The belief is true. The justification seems perfectly adequate. They looked at a clock and clocks are generally reliable. But this is not knowledge. It is luck. It is coincidence. It is the kind of situation where we want to say the person got it right but did not know. And in the other case, a person believes their colleague owns a Ford because they have seen them driving a Ford for years. They infer from this that someone in the office owns a Ford. And it turns out someone in the office does own a Ford, but it is not the colleague. It is someone else entirely. And again, there is justified true belief, but no knowledge. The justification was good. The belief was true. But the connection between justification and truth went through the wrong path, depended on a falsehood succeeded by accident rather than by the proper relation between evidence and reality. These cases reveal something philosophers had not noticed before, that justification and truth can come apart in subtle ways, that a belief can be justified and true without the justification being what makes it true, without the truth being because of the justification. And this gap, this disconnect, this possibility of luck intervening between justification and truth is what makes justified true belief insufficient for knowledge. And once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. It becomes obvious that knowledge requires not just justification and truth, but the right connection between them. Requires that the truth be non-accidental, be because of rather than merely accompanied by the justification. And this seems like it should be easy to fix, should be easy to add to the definition. Just require that the belief be justified and true, and not get-eared, not undermined by luck, not true by accident, and problem solved. But this is where the real trouble begins, because no one can say what it means for a belief to be non-accidentally true. No one can define luck in a way that is not circular, not question-begging, not itself dependent on an intuitive grasp of what knowledge is. The natural move is to say that knowledge requires a reliable connection between belief and truth, that the method that produced the belief must be one that generally produces true beliefs. And this is reliabilism, the view that knowledge is reliably produced true belief. And this avoids get-ear cases because in get-ear cases, the belief is not reliably produced, the stopped clock is not a reliable method. The inference from the colleague's Ford to someone owning a Ford goes through an unreliable intermediate step. And so reliabilism can say these are not knowledge because they fail the reliability condition. But reliabilism faces its own problems. It faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify the relevant type of belief. Forming process, because any process can be described at many levels of generality. Looking at a clock is a reliable process, but looking at this particular stopped clock is not. And which description is the right one? Which is the type that matters for knowledge? And there seems to be no non-arbitrary way to answer this, no principle that determines the correct level of generality. And without such a principle, reliabilism cannot be applied, cannot deliver verdicts about particular cases, cannot do the work a theory of knowledge is supposed to do. Goldman tried to solve this with proper function, with the idea that the relevant process is the one that evolution, or learning, or some other natural process designed the cognitive system to perform. And this gives a non-arbitrary way to pick out process types, but it introduces new problems. Problems about what counts as proper function, about whether knowledge requires biological or social or individual design, about whether malfunction always destroys knowledge or only sometimes. And these questions proved as difficult as the original Gettier problem, generated their own literature, their own debates, their own unresolved puzzles. Others tried causal theories, theories that said knowledge requires a causal connection between the fact and the belief, that you can only know that Pi if P causes your belief that P, and this handles some Gettier cases. The stopped clock case involves no causal connection between the actual time and the belief about the time. But causal theories face problems with knowledge of abstract objects, with mathematical knowledge, with knowledge of the future, with any case where the thing known does not seem capable of causing beliefs, and the theory had to be abandoned or modified into something so hedged with qualifications that it lost its initial appeal, its initial promise of solving Gettier with a simple, elegant condition. Nozick proposed tracking, the idea that knowledge requires that the belief track the truth, that if P were false, the person would not believe P, and if P were true in nearby circumstances, the person would believe P, and this captures something important, captures the idea that knowledge involves a kind of sensitivity to truth, a responsiveness that is missing in Gettier cases. But tracking faces problems too, problems with closure, the principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you can know Q by inference. Because tracking does not preserve closure. You can track one truth without tracking what it entails. And this means Nozick's theory implies you can know you have hands without knowing you are not a brain in a vat. And this seems wrong, seems like a bullet too large to bite. And most philosophers rejected tracking for this reason, even while acknowledging it captured something about knowledge that justified true belief missed. The pattern repeats endlessly. Someone proposes a fourth condition, someone finds a counterexample, the condition is modified, new counterexamples appear, the modifications multiply, the theory becomes baroque, loses its explanatory power, and eventually is abandoned in favour of a new approach that promises to avoid the problems of its predecessors. And this new approach inevitably faces its own counterexamples, its own difficulties, its own descent into complexity and qualification. And after 60 years of this, the epistemological community is no closer to a widely accepted definition of knowledge than it was when Gettier published his paper. And some have begun to suspect that this is not a temporary problem, not a sign that philosophers have not been clever enough, but a permanent feature of the concept of knowledge itself, a sign that knowledge resists analysis, that it cannot be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, that the classical project of defining knowledge is not incomplete, but impossible. Williamson argued exactly this. He claimed that knowledge is primitive, that it cannot be analysed into more basic components, that it is a mental state in its own right, rather than a compound of belief and justification and truth. And this means the Gettier problem is not a problem to be solved, but a symptom of trying to do something that cannot be done, like trying to define yellow in terms of non-colour concepts, like trying to analyse consciousness into purely physical terms. And if Williamson is right, then all the attempts to fix the justified true belief analysis, all the fourth conditions and modifications and qualifications were doomed from the start. We're trying to define the undefinable, to analyse the primitive, and the right response is not to keep trying but to give up, to accept that knowledge is basic, that epistemology can still study its properties and relations without being able to define it, that not everything can be reduced to simpler components. But this seems like defeat, seems like giving up on philosophy's traditional task, and many resist it, continue to search for a definition, continue to propose new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding the connection between belief and truth that knowledge requires. And this persistence is partly admirable, partly stubborn refusal to accept limits, and partly a failure to recognize when a project has failed, when the evidence is overwhelming that the goal is unreachable, that the concept being analyzed is not structured the way analysis assumes. And the question is which interpretation is correct, whether continued work on the analysis of knowledge is noble persistence or futile stubbornness, whether the next theory might finally succeed or whether success is impossible. The externalism-internalism debate intersects with all of this, because Gettier cases reveal a tension between what the believer has access to and what makes belief knowledge. The person with justified true belief in a Gettier case cannot tell from the inside that they lack knowledge, cannot distinguish their situation from genuine knowledge by introspection or reflection. And this suggests that knowledge depends on external factors, on how the belief was actually formed, on whether the process was reliable, on whether the connection to truth was proper, and these are not things the believer necessarily has access to, not things that show up in consciousness, not things that can be known by reflection alone. And this means externalism is true. Knowledge is partly constituted by factors external to the mind, by relations to the environment that the knower may not be aware of. And this is deeply counterintuitive, deeply at odds with the Cartesian picture, where knowledge is transparent to the knower, where what one knows is fully accessible to reflection, where the mental is self-intimating and clear. But Gettier forces this conclusion, forces the recognition that knowledge can depend on facts. The knower does not, and perhaps cannot know, that there can be twins who are internally identical but differ in knowledge because they differ in environment. And this seems to violate something important about the nature of mind, about the privacy of the mental, about the authority each person has over their own beliefs. Yet the alternative seems worse, seems to deny that knowledge requires any external connection to reality at all, seems to make knowledge purely a matter of internal coherence or justification, and this would allow the brain in a vat to have knowledge, would make knowledge independent of truth, would sever the connection between mind and world that knowledge seems essentially to involve. The lottery paradox connects to Gettier through the problem of knowledge of conjunction. You know that ticket 1 will not win. You know that ticket 2 will not win. You know this for each ticket individually, because the probability of any ticket winning is negligible, but you cannot know that some ticket will win. Even though you know this must be true, and this seems wrong, seems like knowledge should be closed under conjunction, should allow you to put together things you know into knowledge of their conjunction. But if it does, then you can know both that no particular ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these cannot both be known because they contradict. And this reveals something about the nature of knowledge, that it is not simply high probability, not simply justified belief that is very likely to be true, but something more demanding, something that excludes a certain kind of luck or chance. And this connects to Gettier because Gettier cases are cases where justified true belief holds, but knowledge fails because of luck, because of accident, because the truth was not guaranteed by the justification. And the lottery case suggests that knowledge requires guarantee, requires that the truth not be accidental, but what counts as guarantee? What excludes accident? These questions have no clear answer, no consensus, no definition that everyone accepts. Contextualism tries to solve some of these problems by saying that whether someone knows depends on context, on what alternatives are relevant, on how demanding the standards are in the conversational situation, and in ordinary contexts, knowledge is easy to have, requires only that obvious alternatives be ruled out. but in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are raised, where brain-in-vat possibilities are mentioned, the standards rise and knowledge becomes harder or impossible to have. And this explains why knowledge seems to come and go, why we are happy to say we know things in ordinary life, but hesitate when doing philosophy. But contextualism faces problems too. Problems about whether the standards really vary or whether we are just more careful in philosophical contexts. Problems about how context determines standards. Problems about disagreement between people in different contexts who seem to be making incompatible claims. And like every other approach to knowledge after Gettier, contextualism captures something, but fails to capture everything, solves some problems, but creates others, and the dialectic continues, endlessly, inconclusively. Zagzebski showed that any analysis of knowledge that adds conditions to justify true belief to avoid Gettier will face its own Gettier-style counterexamples, that there is a recipe for generating such cases, and this is a kind of meta-Gettier problem, a problem not just with the original definition, but with the entire project of modifying it. And her argument suggests that the problem is not with particular proposals, but with the form of analysis itself, with the attempt to understand knowledge as justified true belief plus something. And if she's right, then the only options are to abandon analysis entirely, as Williamson suggests, or to abandon the justified true belief framework altogether, to start from scratch with a completely different approach. And some have tried this, have proposed that knowledge is a kind of ability, that it is acquaintance with facts, that it is constituted by the safety or sensitivity of belief, that it is a matter of having conclusive reasons, and each of these departs from the traditional framework. Each tries to rethink knowledge from the ground up, but each also faces objections. Each struggles to handle the full range of cases. Each eventually generates its own literature of problems and refinements and counterexamples. The phenomenon of epistemic luck is at the heart of all this. Gettier cases are cases of epistemic luck, cases where true belief is not the result of epistemic virtue or proper cognitive functioning, but of fortunate coincidence, and knowledge excludes epistemic luck. This much seems clear, but epistemic luck comes in many forms. Veritic luck, where the truth is accidental. Evidential luck, where the evidence is accidentally good. Content luck, where the belief happens to be about something true by coincidence. And maybe knowledge is incompatible with some forms of luck, but not others. Maybe some amount of luck is inevitable in any finite cognitive system operating in an uncertain world, and the question is where to draw the line. Which kinds of luck destroy knowledge and which do not? And there seems to be no principled way to answer this. No theory that gets all the cases right. No definition that excludes exactly the right amount of luck without excluding too much or too little. Sosa's virtue epistemology tries to handle this by saying that knowledge is true, belief that is accurate because adroit, because of the exercise of cognitive ability, and Gettier cases fail because they are accurate, but not because adroit. The belief is true, but not because of skill, and this seems promising, seems to capture what goes wrong in Gettier cases, but it faces questions about what counts as ability, about whether being in a good environment is part of ability or a separate factor, about whether knowledge requires that ability be exercised in the right way, or just that it be exercised. And these questions prove difficult, generate their own debates, and the theory fragments into animal knowledge and reflective knowledge, and different grades of knowledge. And what started as a simple, elegant idea becomes complex and qualified and contested. The situationist challenge from social psychology raises doubts about whether cognitive abilities even exist, whether there are stable traits that manifest across situations, or whether behavior, including cognitive behavior, is mostly determined by situation rather than character. And if situationism is right, then virtue epistemology is based on a false assumption, based on the idea that people have stable cognitive abilities, when really They have only situational responses. And this would not just undermine one theory of knowledge, but would call into question the entire picture of knowledge as something stable, something dispositional, something that inheres in persons rather than emerging from person-situation interactions. And while most epistemologists have not taken situationism seriously, have not fully grappled with its implications, it represents a potential crisis, a challenge from outside philosophy that could overturn assumptions epistemology has relied on for centuries. The Gettier problem has become emblematic of philosophy's condition, of its inability to solve problems definitively, to reach consensus, to make progress in the way sciences do, and critics point to 60 years of post-Gettier epistemology as evidence that philosophy is confused, that it asks questions that have no answers, that it pursues definitions that cannot be given, and defenders respond. That philosophy is hard, that concepts like knowledge are genuinely complex, that the lack of consensus is not failure, but the nature of inquiry into fundamental questions. But the defense sounds hollow after decades of effort that have produced no solution, no widely. When probability contradicts intuition, there is a game show, a host, 3 doors, behind one door a car, behind the other 2 goats. The contestant picks a door. The host, who knows what is behind each door, opens a different door, revealing a goat. Then offers the contestant a choice: stay with the original door or switch to the remaining unopened door. And almost everyone's intuition says, it does not matter, says the probability is now 50-50, says switching and staying are equivalent because there are 2 doors left and one has the car. But this intuition is completely wrong. Switching doubles the chance of winning, gives a 2/3 probability instead of 1/3, and this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of Let's Make a Deal. And it has become famous not just as a probability puzzle, but as a demonstration of how badly human intuition performs with probability, how confidently people cling to wrong answers, how even mathematicians and statisticians initially rejected the correct solution. And this raises deep questions about rationality, about whether humans are capable of probabilistic reasoning, about whether intuition can be trusted in any domain, about what it means to be rational if rationality requires calculations that almost no one can perform. The solution requires seeing that the initial choice had a 1/3 chance of being correct, which means there was a 2/3 chance the car was behind one of the other 2 doors. And when the host opens one of those doors revealing a goat, that 2/3 probability does not disappear, it transfers entirely to the remaining unopened door. So switching gives a 2/3 chance while staying gives only the original 1/3 chance. And this can be proven mathematically, can be demonstrated through computer simulation, can be explained through careful reasoning about conditional probability, but none of this stops people from insisting the answer must be 50-50, from rejecting the correct solution as absurd, from trusting their intuition over the mathematics. And this is not stupidity, not ignorance, not carelessness. This is the way human minds naturally process probability, the way intuition works when confronted with conditional probabilities and updating in light of new evidence. And the fact that intuition gets it wrong reveals something troubling about human rationality, about the gap between how we think we reason and how we actually reason, about the possibility that many of our confident judgments about probability are as wrong as the intuition that switching does not matter. Bayesian epistemology takes probability as fundamental to rational belief, says that beliefs should be assigned degrees of confidence, that these degrees should obey the probability calculus, that they should update through Bayes' theorem when new evidence arrives. And this seems like the right way to think about belief, seems to capture how science works, how learning happens, how rational agents should respond to evidence. But the Monty Hall problem shows that humans are not natural Bayesians, do not intuitively update probabilities correctly, do not automatically apply Bayes' theorem, do not even recognize when a situation calls for probabilistic reasoning rather than simple counting. And if this is true, then Bayesian epistemology is not a description of how humans actually reason, but a normative standard that almost no one meets, an ideal that is psychologically unrealistic, a requirement for rationality that makes rationality impossible for creatures like us. Kahneman and Tversky spent decades documenting the ways human probability judgments deviate from normative standards. The base rate neglect, where people ignore prior probabilities. The conjunction fallacy, where people judge conjunctions more probable than their components. The availability heuristic, where people estimate probability based on how easily examples come to mind. And these are not occasional errors, but systematic biases. Not mistakes that education eliminates, but deep features of human cognition that persist, even in experts, even in people who understand probability theory, even in situations where people are explicitly trying to reason correctly. And this research suggests that human minds are not built for probability, that our intuitions evolved for different problems, for quick judgments in environments where exact probabilities were unknown and unknowable, where rough heuristics that usually worked were better than precise calculations that took too long, and these heuristics still dominate our thinking, still produce judgments that feel right even when they are mathematically wrong. And the question is whether we should try to override these intuitions, should try to become more Bayesian, should train ourselves to calculate rather than intuit, or whether we should accept that humans are not and cannot be perfectly rational in the Bayesian sense, should build theories of rationality that fit how we actually think, rather than demanding we think in ways that are psychologically impossible. The reference class problem makes this even more difficult, because applying probability requires knowing what reference class to use, what group of similar cases to draw on when estimating probability, and there is often no unique right answer. Many reference classes are possible. They give different probabilities, and there is no mechanical rule for choosing among them. Only judgment, only intuition, only the same kind of thinking that gets Monty Hall wrong. And this means that even if humans could perfectly apply Bayes' theorem, even if we could update probabilities flawlessly, we would still face the problem of choosing which probabilities to start with, which reference class to use, which background assumptions to make. And these choices are not themselves governed by probability theory, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of rational constraint that Bayesianism promises. And this suggests that probabilistic rationality cannot be purely computational, cannot be reduced to algorithms, cannot eliminate the need for judgment that might be right or wrong in ways that transcend calculation. Subjective Bayesianism tries to handle this by saying that prior probabilities are subjective, are personal degrees of confidence that can differ between rational agents. And as long as priors satisfy the probability axioms and updating follows Bayes' theorem, any priors are rationally permissible, and agents with different priors will converge on the same posteriors given enough shared evidence, or so the theorem says. But this convergence can take a very long time, can require more evidence than is ever available. And in the meantime, agents with different priors will reach different conclusions, will make different predictions, will act differently, and there is no rational way to adjudicate between them. No standard that says one set of priors is better than another. No requirement beyond internal consistency, and this seems too permissive, seems to make rationality trivial, seems to allow anything as rational as long as it obeys the probability calculus. And conspiracy theorists obey the probability calculus. They just have different priors. They assign high probability to things most people assign low probability to, and they update on evidence in their own way. And by subjective Bayesian standards, they might be perfectly rational, just starting from different priors. And this cannot be right. This is not what rationality means. There must be some constraint on priors, some requirement beyond consistency, some standard that distinguishes reasonable from unreasonable starting points. But what that standard is, how to specify it, how to justify it without circularity, these questions have no clear answer. Objective Bayesianism tries to solve this by saying there are objective priors, that some probability assignments are privileged by logic or symmetry or information theory, that the principle of indifference or maximum entropy or some other principle determines what priors rationality requires. But each of these principles faces problems. The principle of indifference leads to paradoxes when applied to continuous quantities or overlapping partitions. Maximum entropy requires choosing a measure, and different measures give different entropies, and none of these principles seems to capture what we pre-theoretically think rationality requires. None of them vindicates our intuitive judgments about which beliefs are reasonable. And this suggests that the project of grounding probability in pure logic or symmetry has failed, that probability is not a priori but depends on empirical facts, on the actual frequencies in the world, on the causal structure of reality. And this leads back to frequentism, to the view that probabilities are objective features of the world, are long-run frequencies or propensities or chances built into the physical processes. But frequentism faces its own problems. The reference class problem returns, the problem of single cases where frequency makes no sense, the problem that different sequences can have the same frequency but seem to have different probabilities, and the debate between subjective and objective interpretations of probability remains unresolved. Remains one of the deepest puzzles in philosophy of science and epistemology, remains a place where intuition gives conflicting verdicts and mathematics does not uniquely determine the right answer. The Monty Hall problem can be generalized, can be seen as an instance of a broader phenomenon where updating on evidence is counterintuitive, where the correct probability depends on assumptions about the process that generated the evidence, about whether the host had to open a door with a goat or could have opened any door, about whether the host knows where the car is or is opening doors randomly, and changing these assumptions changes the correct answer, changes whether switching is advantageous, and this shows that probability is not just about counting possibilities, but about modeling processes, about understanding the causal structure that generates observations, about getting the model right before applying the mathematics. And humans are bad at this, bad at seeing which model applies, bad at noticing when assumptions have changed, bad at tracking the difference between probability given this model and probability given that model. And this is another way intuition fails, another place where what seems obvious is wrong, another demonstration that probabilistic reasoning is hard, harder than it seems, harder than most people realize. The three prisoners problem is similar. Three prisoners, one will be pardoned, a guard knows who but will not tell. One prisoner asks the guard to name one of the other prisoners who will not be pardoned. The guard names one, and the prisoner reasons that his probability of pardon has increased from 1/3 to 1/2 because now there are only two prisoners in the running. But this reasoning is wrong. His probability is still 1/3. The other prisoner's probability is now 2/3. And this is the same structure as Monty Hall, the same failure of intuition, the same mistake of thinking that eliminating one possibility distributes its probability equally among the remainder, when really the distribution depends on how the elimination happened, on whether it was random or constrained by knowledge. And the fact that the same mistake appears in different guises, that people make the same error repeatedly, even after being corrected, suggests this is not a mistake about particular problems, but a mistake about how probability works. A fundamental misunderstanding of conditional probability, of updating, of what it means for probabilities to change in light of evidence. Simpson's paradox is another case where intuition fails, where a trend appears in several groups, but reverses when the groups are combined, where a treatment seems effective in every subgroup but harmful overall, where the correct probability judgment depends on which level of description you adopt, which grouping you consider relevant, and there is often no mathematical fact about which grouping is right, only substantive judgment about causal structure, about which variables are relevant, about what the right reference class is. And this is the reference class problem again. The problem that probability requires not just mathematics, but modelling, not just calculation, but judgment. And judgment can be wrong in ways that calculation cannot, can depend on intuitions that mislead, can vary between people who have access to the same mathematical facts. And this means that probabilistic rationality is not purely formal, not reducible to following rules, not something that could be programmed into a computer without also giving the computer the ability to model the world, to understand causal structure, to make substantive judgments about relevance and independence and which factors matter. And these abilities seem to require something like understanding, something like intelligence, something that goes beyond computation in any narrow sense. The Sleeping Beauty problem pushes this even further. Sleeping Beauty is put to sleep on Sunday. A fair coin is flipped. If heads, she is woken on Monday, and the experiment ends. If tails, she is woken on Monday, put back to sleep with memory erasure, and woken again on Tuesday. And when she wakes, she knows all this, but not what day it is or how the coin landed. And she's asked what probability she should assign to heads. And one argument says 1/2 because it is a fair coin, and her evidence does not distinguish heads from tails. And another argument says 1/3 because there are 3 possible wakings: Monday heads, Monday tails, Tuesday tails, and she should be equally uncertain about which one she is experiencing. And both arguments seem compelling. Both seem to capture something right about probability, but they give different answers, and philosophers have divided into halfers and thirders, have written papers and books arguing for their position, and no consensus has emerged, no decisive argument has appeared. And this suggests that probability itself is ambiguous, that there is no fact of the matter about. What probability means in cases like this, that different probability concepts give different answers, and there is no neutral standpoint from which to say which concept is correct. And if this is true, then rationality does not uniquely determine belief, does not provide the kind of objective standard that Bayesianism promised, allows for rational disagreement, even given identical evidence and identical priors in some sense. And this is disturbing, suggests that rationality is weaker than we thought, less constraining, less objective, more dependent on choices about how to frame problems and which probability concept to apply. The fine-tuning argument in philosophy of religion uses probability reasoning that many find suspicious, claims that the probability of a life-permitting universe is extremely low on naturalism, but not as low on theism, and therefore the existence of a life-permitting universe is evidence for theism. And this argument has the structure of Bayesian inference, has priors and likelihoods, and posteriors, but the probabilities involved seem impossible to specify, seem to require knowing about the space of possible universes and the probability distribution over them, and whether such probabilities even make sense. And skeptics argue that the argument trades on intuitions about probability that are as unreliable as the intuition that switching does not matter in Monty Hall, that it smuggles in assumptions through choices about reference classes, that it treats unknown probabilities as if they were 50-50 when there is no justification for this, and defenders argue that this is the only way to reason about such questions. That probability is the language of uncertainty, and if we cannot use probability, we cannot reason about unlikely events at all. And both sides seem right in some sense. Both seem to be pointing to real problems, and the debate remains unresolved because there is no agreed standard for when probability reasoning applies, for what makes a probability assignment reasonable, for how to choose reference classes in novel situations. The anthropic principle raises similar issues. The observation that we exist as observers places constraints on what we can observe. We cannot observe universes that do not permit observers, and this truism has been turned into arguments about probability, about whether observer selection effects should change our credences, about whether the fact that we are here is evidence for multiverse theories or fine-tuning or something else, and different formulations of the anthropic principle give different answers. The self-sampling assumption says you should reason as if you are a random sample from all observers. The self-indication assumption says you should favour theories that predict more observers, and these give conflicting recommendations, give different probabilities for the same observations, and there is no consensus about which is correct, no compelling argument that one captures rationality and the other does not. And this is another instance of the general problem, that probability reasoning requires background assumptions, requires choices about how to set up the problem, and these choices are not dictated by probability theory itself, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of objective, rational constraint that would make probabilistic epistemology a complete theory of rational belief. The possibility remains that human intuition about probability, despite being systematically wrong in many cases, is right in some deeper sense, is adapted to a different kind of rationality than mathematical probability captures, is tuned to ecological rather than abstract problems, to frequencies encountered in real environments rather than to single-case probabilities in artificial puzzles. And Gigerenzer has argued exactly this, has argued that humans are better at frequency reasoning than probability reasoning, that framing Monty Hall in terms of frequencies rather than probabilities makes the right answer intuitive, that many of the biases Kahneman and Tversky documented disappear when problems are presented in ways that match our evolutionary history. And this suggests that the problem is not with human rationality, but with the mismatch between how probability theory frames problems and how human minds naturally frame them. And if this is right, then the solution is not to train people to be more Bayesian, but to recognize that formal probability is one tool among many, appropriate for some contexts but not others, and that intuitive reasoning has its own logic, its own standards, its own domain of applicability, and trying to replace it entirely with formal calculation would be a mistake, would lose something valuable, would sacrifice the kind of quick approximate reasoning that actually works in most real-world situations for the sake of precision that is rarely achievable and often not worth the computational cost. Balancing intuition and theory. There is a method in philosophy that claims to find truth not by discovering foundations, not by building from self-evident axioms, not by appealing to revelation or pure reason, but by seeking coherence, by adjusting beliefs until they fit together, by moving back and forth between particular judgments and general principles until a stable equilibrium is reached. And this method is called reflective equilibrium, and it was developed most fully by John Rawls in his work on justice, though the idea stretches back through the history of philosophy, back to the recognition that neither pure theory nor pure intuition can be trusted alone, that each must constrain and correct the other. That truth emerges from their interaction rather than from either in isolation. The process begins with considered judgments, with the moral intuitions people have about particular cases. Intuitions like slavery is wrong, promise breaking requires justification, causing unnecessary suffering is bad, and these intuitions are the raw material, the data that ethical theory must account for, but they are not infallible, not sacrosanct, not immune to revision. They are provisional starting points that might be mistaken, might be the product of bias or prejudice or limited understanding, and the method acknowledges this, acknowledges that intuitions can be wrong while still insisting they are the only place to start, the only access we have to moral reality, because if we do not begin with intuitions, then where do we begin? What other source of moral knowledge is there? And the answer seems to be none. No pure reason that delivers ethical truths, no perception that reveals moral facts, no authority that can be trusted without question. Only the messy collection of judgments people make about cases, judgments that often conflict. that differ across cultures, that change over time, and yet somehow, from this unpromising material, moral philosophy must be constructed. Rawls distinguished between narrow and wide reflective equilibrium. Narrow equilibrium is achieved when particular judgments and general principles are brought into coherence with each other, but nothing else. When the theory fits the intuitions and the intuitions fit the theory, but no attention is paid to alternative theories, to background beliefs, to empirical facts about human nature or social organization. And this is relatively easy to achieve, but not very stable, not very trustworthy, because it might be that another theory fits the intuitions just as well, might be that the intuitions themselves rest on false empirical beliefs, might be that the whole system is coherent but disconnected from reality. A beautiful castle built on sand and wide equilibrium tries to avoid this by expanding the scope of what must cohere, by requiring that the theory fit not just with moral intuitions but with considered beliefs about psychology, about society, about human nature, with alternative moral theories that have been seriously considered and rejected for good reasons. And this makes equilibrium harder to achieve, but more robust, more likely to track truth rather than merely achieve internal consistency, because it forces the theorist to confront challenges, to test the theory against competitors, to ensure that coherence is not just local, but global, not just moral, but includes everything the person believes. But this raises an immediate problem, the problem of whether intuitions are really data, whether they deserve the role Rawls assigns them, whether they are observations of moral reality or merely expressions of cultural conditioning, of evolutionary adaptation, of psychological bias. And if intuitions are not perceptions of moral facts, but products of contingent causal processes, then why should they constrain theory at all? Why not just construct moral theory from scratch using pure reason, using consistency and simplicity and other theoretical virtues, and let the intuitions fall where they may? And some philosophers have argued exactly this, have argued that intuitions are unreliable, that they differ too much across individuals and cultures to be evidence, that they are shaped by factors that have nothing to do with truth, by emotion and self-interest and social pressure. And if this is right, then reflective equilibrium is not a method for discovering moral truth, but for rationalizing prejudice, for systematizing whatever intuitions one happens to have, for building coherent theories that reflect nothing more than the contingent moral psychology of the theorist. Rawls was aware of this objection. He restricted the relevant intuitions to considered judgments made under favourable conditions, when the person is calm and informed and has no personal stake in the outcome, when they are not distracted by irrelevant factors, when they have thought carefully about the case, and this restriction is supposed to filter out the unreliable intuitions, the ones produced by bias or emotion or confusion, and leave only the reliable ones, the ones that are genuinely responsive to moral reality. But critics ask how we know which intuitions are made under favourable conditions, how we distinguish the reliable from the unreliable without already having a moral theory. And if we need a theory to identify good intuitions, then we cannot use intuitions to build the theory. We are reasoning in a circle, using theory to select data and data to support theory. And this circularity seems vicious, seems to undermine the entire method, because it means we can get any result we want just by choosing the right intuitions, by labeling the intuitions that fit our preferred theory as considered judgments and dismissing the rest as unreliable. And there is no independent check, no way to break into the circle from outside, no neutral standpoint from which to evaluate whether the equilibrium reached tracks truth or merely reflects the prejudices we started with. Goodman faced a similar problem in the philosophy of science with his work on induction. He argued that inductive rules are justified by their conformity to accepted inductive inferences, and accepted inferences are justified by their conformity to rules. And this seems circular in the same way, seems to justify induction by appeal to induction. But Goodman argued the circularity was not vicious but virtuous, that this is how justification works, not by reduction to foundations but by mutual support, by coherence among elements, none of which are independently justified, but which together form a stable system. And Rawls borrowed this idea, applied it to ethics, argued that moral theory is justified the same way, not by derivation from self-evident principles, but by coherence with considered judgments. And just as scientific method is justified by its success in producing reliable predictions and explanations, moral theory is justified by its success in organizing and explaining moral phenomena, in capturing what is right about our intuitions while correcting what is wrong. And this is not circular reasoning, but reflective reasoning, reasoning that loops back on itself, that uses its own outputs as inputs, that gradually refines itself through iteration. And the result is not certainty, but reasonable confidence, not proof, but the best we can do given our epistemic situation. Given that we are finite creatures trying to understand domains that exceed our individual capacities. But the analogy to science is controversial because science has a reality check, has observation and experiment, has ways of testing theories against the world that do not depend entirely on coherence. And ethics lacks this, has no moral microscope, no way to observe moral facts independently of intuition. And if intuitions are all we have, then coherence among them is just coherence among beliefs, is not evidence of truth, but only evidence of consistency. And many philosophers have argued that this is not enough, that ethics needs something more than reflective equilibrium, needs some external constraint, some connection to reality that goes beyond mere coherence. And this is where moral realism enters. The view that there are objective moral facts independent of human belief, facts that make moral judgments true or false. And the realist thinks reflective equilibrium might accidentally hit on truth, but cannot guarantee it, cannot ensure that the equilibrium reached corresponds to reality rather than just organizing our prejudices into a coherent system, while the anti-realist thinks there are no moral facts, that all ethics can do is organize intuitions into coherent systems, and reflective equilibrium is the best method available because it is the only method available, because there is nothing beyond coherence to aim for. Singer challenges reflective equilibrium from a different angle. He argues that many widely shared intuitions are simply wrong, are products of speciesism or other biases, and that a good moral theory should reject these intuitions rather than accommodate them, should revise our judgments radically rather than merely refining them. And if Singer is right, then reflective equilibrium is too conservative, too wedded to existing intuitions, too reluctant to overturn established moral beliefs. And the method will never lead to radical moral progress, will never challenge deeply held prejudices, will only produce theories that ratify the status quo with minor modifications. And this seems like a serious problem, because the history of ethics is a history of moral progress, of learning that practices once thought acceptable were actually wrong, of expanding the moral circle to include those previously excluded, and this progress often required rejecting intuitions that seemed obvious to earlier generations. Rejecting the intuition that women were inferior, that slavery was natural, that animals had no moral status, and if these intuitions had been treated as data to be preserved in reflective equilibrium, then moral progress would have been impossible. The method would have locked in the prejudices of the age rather than enabling their critique. Rawls responds that reflective equilibrium does allow for revision of intuitions, that the process is not conservative but dialectical, that general principles can lead us to reject particular judgments when they conflict, that the equilibrium reached might be quite distant from the intuitions we started with, and he points to his own theory of justice, which leads to conclusions many people find counterintuitive, which argues for principles that would radically transform existing social arrangements. And this shows that the method does not simply ratify existing beliefs, but can challenge them, can lead to revisionary conclusions. But the question remains whether it can challenge them enough, whether the method is capable of truly radical critique, or whether it is always pulled back toward the mainstream by the weight of established intuitions, by the requirement that theory accommodate at least some of our considered judgments. And if it cannot accommodate any judgments, then what is the point of reflective equilibrium? Why not just do pure moral theory without regard for intuitions? And this is the tension at the heart of the method, the need to respect intuitions while remaining open to revising them, the need to start somewhere while acknowledging that the starting point might be entirely wrong. Parfit distinguished between two kinds of moral theorizing: bottom-up theorizing that starts with intuitions and builds principles to explain them, and top-down theorizing that starts with principles and derives conclusions regardless of whether they match intuitions. And reflective equilibrium is supposed to be neither purely bottom-up nor purely top-down, but a combination, a method that moves in both directions, that uses principles to test intuitions and intuitions to test principles. But in practice, most philosophers lean one way or the other. Some trust intuitions more and will reject theories that conflict with strong intuitions, no matter how elegant the theory, while others trust theory more and will reject intuitions no matter how strong, if the theory implies they're wrong. And this split reflects deeper disagreements about the nature of moral knowledge, about whether ethics is more like perception, where we observe facts, or more like mathematics, where we reason from axioms. And reflective equilibrium tries to split the difference, but might satisfy neither side, might be too rationalist for the intuitionists and too intuitionist for the rationalists, might be a compromise that inherits the weaknesses of both approaches without fully gaining the strengths of either. The theory-ladenness of observation is a problem in science, and an even bigger problem in ethics, because intuitions are not neutral observations, but are shaped by the theories we already hold, by the concepts we use, by the categories we think in. And this means that intuitions cannot serve as independent checks on theory, because they are already contaminated by theory, are already expressions of theoretical commitments rather than raw data. And when we achieve reflective equilibrium between intuitions and theory, we might just be finding coherence between a theory and the intuitions that theory itself generated. We are making the theory consistent with its own implications rather than with independent reality. And this is not a test, not a confirmation, not evidence of truth. It is just circular reasoning dressed up as a method. And the only way to break the circle would be to have theory-neutral intuitions, intuitions that are not shaped by any theoretical commitments. But such intuitions might not exist, might be impossible, because all judgment requires concepts, and all concepts embody theoretical assumptions, and this means we are trapped inside our conceptual schemes, unable to step outside them to check whether they correspond to reality, unable to do anything but reorganize them into more or less coherent patterns. Neurath's boat is the metaphor often used here. The idea that we are like sailors who must rebuild their ship while at sea, who cannot return to dry dock, who must stand on some planks while replacing others, who can never inspect the whole. Structure at once, but must trust that the parts they are not currently working on are sound enough to support them, and reflective equilibrium is like this, is a process of revising beliefs, while standing on other beliefs, of using some judgments to evaluate others without ever having a belief-free standpoint, without ever achieving the kind of foundation that traditional epistemology sought. And this seems precarious, seems to offer no guarantee of truth, seems to allow for the possibility that the entire system could be coherent but false, that we could achieve perfect equilibrium while being radically wrong about everything. And defenders of the method acknowledge this possibility, but argue it is unavoidable, argue that there is no alternative, that all reasoning is like this, that the demand for foundations is a mistake, that coherence is not a second-best substitute for foundation, but the only kind of justification there is. And we must either accept this or give up on justification entirely, give up on the possibility of distinguishing better from worse beliefs. And this is not acceptable. So we must accept reflective equilibrium, despite its limitations, despite its circularity, despite its inability to guarantee truth. The method has been applied beyond ethics, has been used in epistemology and metaphysics, and even in empirical sciences, wherever there is a need to balance theory and data, wherever neither can be trusted absolutely, wherever truth seems to emerge from coherence rather than correspondence. And this generalization suggests the method captures something deep about human reasoning, something about how finite creatures with limited access to reality must navigate uncertainty, must construct understanding from partial and fallible materials, must accept that justification is always provisional, always subject to revision, always dependent on a network of beliefs that might themselves need revision. And this is not skepticism, not the claim that we cannot know anything, but fallibilism, the claim that we can know things but cannot know them with certainty, cannot eliminate the possibility of error, cannot achieve the kind of absolute justification that philosophers once sought but must settle for something weaker, something more human, something that acknowledges our limitations, while still insisting that some beliefs are better justified than others, that some theories fit the evidence better than others, that coherence matters even if it does not guarantee truth. The psychological research on moral intuitions complicates the picture further, because it shows that intuitions are fast, automatic, emotionally laden judgments that often precede reasoning rather than result from it, that people typically judge first and justify later, that the reasoning we offer for moral judgments is often post hoc rationalization rather than the actual cause of the judgment. And if this is true, then reflective equilibrium is not a description of how moral thinking actually works, but a normative ideal, a recommendation for how it should work. And the question is whether this ideal is achievable, whether people can actually suspend their automatic judgments long enough to engage in the kind of reflective process Rawls describes, whether we can override our intuitions when theory demands it, or whether we are psychologically incapable of this, whether our reasoning is always in service of our intuitions rather than capable of genuinely evaluating them. And if we are psychologically incapable of genuine reflective equilibrium, then the method is not just difficult, but impossible, is an ideal that cannot be realized, and all actual moral theorizing is just rationalization of intuitions that we are stuck with, that we cannot revise no matter how much we reflect. And this would be a devastating conclusion, would suggest that moral philosophy is futile, that it cannot correct our biases because those biases are built into the very process of moral thought. But the research is contested, the interpretation is disputed, and many philosophers remain hopeful that reflection can genuinely revise intuition, that humans are capable of the kind of self-correction that reflective equilibrium requires, even if it is difficult, even if it goes against psychological grain, even if most people, most of the time, fail to achieve it